Hey guys, I'm coming to you today from Pittsburg Landing, Tennessee, overlooking the Tennessee River. You can see behind me, and it was here in the early part of 1862. It was actually in March of 1862 that, under orders from his superior, General Alec, General Ulysses S. Grant began to gather his forces after his successful capture of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Further to the north of here, he began to gather his army here for an eventual attack on Corinth, Mississippi, which is a significant Confederate rail hub. At this point in the war, the Union knew it was going to be a long one, and so they started to attack the infrastructure of the Confederacy, and Corinth was key to that. But Grant didn't have his whole force. He had one army here, but he was waiting for a second army, the Army of the Ohio, under command of Don Carlos Buell, and they were still some weeks away. And so when gunboats first came down this river, they actually encountered some troops that were trying to fortify this bluff, Confederate troops, and they drove them off. And so they were able to take positions here. Lew Wallace's division took position on this side of the river while Grant was on the opposite side of the river. Well, eventually, as Grant continued to gather his force and wait for the strength to be able to assault what he thought would be a heavily fortified Confederate position in Corinth, which is about a half-hour drive down the road from here, General Albert Sidney Johnston, the Confederate general, who was a smart guy and well regarded on both sides, in fact considered by many to be the top military mind on either side in the early stages of the war, he decided to attack first, and that eventually became what we know today as the Battle of Shiloh, or in the South, the Battle of Pittsburg Landing. Let's take a look around the battlefield. Well, I'm standing near the Mississippi Monument, beautiful monument here to the Confederate troops from Mississippi. One of those units, very near to the spot where I'm standing, suffered almost 70% casualties. And as I get into the sites of the battlefield, I just want to mention a couple of things about this video. Number one, please don't expect this to be a thorough, exhaustive description of the entire battle. I have a limited number of hours here at the battlefield. I'm here on business, so I'm not really here to be able to spend a lot of time at the battlefield. So I'm not going to get to all the sites, nor am I necessarily going to be able to go step by step in chronological order through the entire battle. So I'm going to hit some of the highlights, visit some of the spots, and talk a little bit about what happened in those spots. I will try to connect the dots as best I can with that. But one observation I would make, in having visited the battlefield, and my perspective on battles always changes when I actually get a chance to visit the battlefield. It's true at Gettysburg, it's true at Antietam, it's definitely true here at Shiloh. I will say that having visited this battlefield, I am much more impressed with what the Confederates were able to accomplish here. The terrain that they were attacking over, even though they took the Union by surprise and so they should have been expected to do well, once the Union kind of got their feet under them and were able to start fighting back, the Confederates really had their work cut out for them. They were attacking uphill for the most part. They were attacking strong defensive positions. They were attacking over a large area, and they were doing so throughout a long fight. So I'm impressed by what the Confederates were able to accomplish, and probably less impressed by the Union position and what they were able to do, just because they had such strong defensive positions throughout. I didn't realize just how strong their positions were on this battlefield and what the Confederates were up against. So let's go take a look. So it's very near to here that the first shots of the Battle of Shiloh were fired. The Confederate troops, about 45,000 of them, were coming up the road from Corinth toward Pittsburg Landing, hoping to surprise the Union troops. And the Union soldiers were under strict orders not to provoke a fight, because they wanted to wait for Buell's army, the Army of the Ohio, to join up with Grant's army so that their combined force could march on the rail depot at Corinth, which is exactly what General Johnston, the Confederate commander, was hoping to prevent. He wanted to hit the Union force before those two armies could link up. Well, unfortunately for Johnston and the Confederates, it had rained for several days in early April, and it slowed their advance. And so by the time they got within striking distance of the Union army, Buell's army was only about a day away. And so what happened was a Union brigade commander in Prentice's division Colonel Everett Peabody, without orders, had sent out a patrol of about 250 men in the early morning hours of April 6th, somewhere like around 3 or 4 in the morning. And just before 5 o'clock in the morning, they got to this spot where I'm standing now, and 3 shots rang out, and some Confederate troops dashed down that road back toward the main lines. They were the advanced scouts for the Confederate Army, and they had run into these scouts sent out by Colonel Peabody, and those were the first shots fired in the Battle of Shiloh. And so while it's true that the Confederate Army did surprise the Union, they knew they were coming at that point. They didn't know how many or when it would happen, but they knew at this point that there was Confederate activity in this area, and it was very soon after that near to here the engagement began. Well, by mid-morning, after the initial Confederate attack had smashed into the Union lines on April 6th, the Union attempted to reform and form a battle line here in probably the most open area of the battlefield. It's known as Duncan's Farm or Duncan Field, and about 6,000 Union soldiers formed a battle line here under W.H.L. Wallace, under Benjamin Prentiss, and I'm standing very near to the right flank of the Union lines, which would be over here behind me across the road. And as you can see, it is a really open area, and if you visit the battlefield, one of the things you'll notice is there are very few open areas. It's almost all woods. So I can see why this would have been a good spot for the Union to draw their battle lines, because they would have had the woods to their back and a nice open field of fire in front of them for the Confederates to come up and over that hill. So behind me, down this fence line, would have been where the Union line extended on the morning, probably 9-10 o'clock in the morning on April 6th. And eventually the Confederates did assault this position, and once again the Union fell back, and probably just a quarter mile behind me, in fact right where the road bends, is where the monument is to where W.H.L. Wallace was mortally wounded, and that's actually the spot where the Hornet Nest begins. So they really didn't fall back all that far from this 9 o'clock a.m. battle line before they got to where the Hornet's Nest was, where they held on for a good bit of the day and honestly saved Grant's army through their actions that slowed down the Confederates to allow time for the reinforcements and for the beleaguered Union troops to form a new battle line and fortifications up on Pittsburg Landing. We're now walking in the direction of the Confederate attack up the hill that leads to the Shiloh Church, maybe another 200 yards from where I am now. And you can see why this would have been a difficult attack for the Confederates. First, they would have had to cross that stream, probably without the help of a bridge there, for mass amounts of Confederate troops. But then, of course, they had to go into the woods and then come further up the hill and attack General Sherman's camp, who by this point was well aware of what was going on, because they would have heard the gunfire a mile away where the initial attack had taken place. So I'm now up on top of the hill at the edge of the woods, and you can see down there where the creek is. But then as you look this way, you can see there's yet another small ravine, and the Confederate troops would have had to go down that hill and then back up again to emerge out of the woods to where Shiloh Church is, just on the other side there. A difficult attack to make for sure, and you can see why the Union would have wanted to hold on to that strong position. And down this road just a little bit further is one of the locations of Confederate mass graves where the Confederate soldiers are buried to this day, and we're going to go take a look at that. Behind me, deep in the woods, it's probably a 5 to 10 minute walk from where you would have to park your car. Deep in the woods near the position of Shiloh Church is one of the mass burial pits dedicated to the fallen Confederate soldiers. And honestly, if the markers weren't here, you would never know that graves were here. Just like on many battlefields where there are probably graves that nobody knows about. But we'll take a look around. Well, behind me is a 1999 nearly exact replica of the Shiloh Methodist Church that gave the battlefield its name. Shiloh, ironically, is a biblical word that means a place of peace. And this church had been built, a little log church, not very big at all, maybe hold a dozen or two people. Had been built about 10 years before the battle. And there's actually a cemetery right across the street that is still to this day having burials. That also was established in 1851. And behind me over here, you'll see that there's the modern Shiloh Methodist Church, which still has worship services to this day here on the battlefield. But on April 6, 1861, this was the location of General William Tecumseh Sherman's division, holding high ground, encamped in this area, not expecting there to be a fight. But assaulted in the early morning by the Confederate troops. And once the Union soldiers had broken from this position, this was the area that P.G.T. Beauregard, who eventually took command of the Confederate Army after Johnston's death, this was where he had his headquarters, and he directed the assault on Pittsburg Landing, and then eventually also directed the retreat back to Corinth on April 7th. When this church was rebuilt in 1999, they used the same style of building that had been used in 1851. They did hand sewing, and they got these logs from trees in this area. So they did everything they could to make this as close to an exact replica of the Shiloh church that stood here as possible. Well, one of the major mistakes early in the battle that General Johnston made for the Confederates was that he believed that Grant's army was arrayed in a north to south position. In other words, his army was facing west with the Tennessee River to their back and Owl Creek in front of them. That wasn't the case. They were actually facing south in between the river and the creek on either flank. And so Johnston's plan had been to hit the Union Army, turn what he thought was their left flank, and push them away from the gunboat protection of the Tennessee River and into Owl Creek, where he hoped they would have to surrender. Now, big plans, obviously, and didn't turn out that way. And what he found very quickly was that rather than attacking the Union left, he was actually attacking the right and the center. The place where I'm standing now, behind me was Colonel Peabody's headquarters. He was the brigade commander of the 1st Brigade under Prentice's division. He was the one who had sent out the pickets early that morning. and had first made contact with the Confederates, and it was actually the 25th Missouri, which was one of the regiments in his command, that was camped in this spot. This is very near to what would have been the Union center. And behind me you see that cannon that's standing up. That is a mortuary cannon, as it's known, and any of the brigade commanders on up who died or were mortally wounded in this battle are represented by one of those cannons, and that is the cannon that represents Colonel Peabody, who was killed on this spot at around 9 a.m. that morning. As you can see, his headquarters was established here March 25th, so they had been here for a little more than a week by the time the Confederates attacked. So you could understand why they may have been a little lax and just felt like nothing was really going to happen. I'm along the road that follows the battlefield, and behind me is a wooded area that actually goes a little downhill, and that is the area that has come to be known as the Hornet's Nest. And it was there for about 8 hours that several thousand Union troops actually held out and refused to give up the fight, even though they were eventually completely surrounded. They held off attack after attack after attack from the Confederate Army. W.H.L. Wallace, who was a division commander, was mortally wounded. The Union general here. Benjamin Prentiss, another Union general, eventually, along with about 2,200 of the remaining Union soldiers who hadn't been killed, wounded, or escaped. Prentiss and those 2,200 men eventually had to surrender when they were completely surrounded by the Confederate troops, but not before having a heroic defense of a strong position that actually, surprisingly, is down the hill, but has woods and then open ground around it. So you can see when you're here how this could have been a strong position to defend from. Well, eventually the Confederates realized that infantry alone was not going to be enough to push the Union troops out of the Hornet's Nest. They assaulted for 6 hours and had no success in driving these Union troops out, and they were clogging the middle of the battlefield, and the Confederates couldn't advance on Pittsburg Landing. So they began to amass artillery, and they massed a lot of artillery. Eventually there were 50 guns, starting in my position here and extending in that direction for about a half a mile. 50 guns. At that point in American history, in North America, it was the largest single concentration of cannons in one location. And they shelled the position in the woods of the Hornet's Nest for about an hour. And it wasn't necessarily meant to drive the Union out, but what it did was it pinned the Union down while Confederate infantry started moving into position on the other sides to encircle the troops. And so it kind of gave them the cover fire they needed to get into position. It was a tactic that eventually was used quite often in later wars, but it was fairly new at this point. Pin your enemy down with covering fire and then get around his position. So that's what they did, and it eventually was successful. We're now following along with what would have been the Confederate right flank We're headed toward the area where General Johnston was mortally wounded. We just passed the wheat field, and we're coming to another open area. These are few and far between, but they do exist here and there on the battlefield. We're definitely near the right flank now of the Confederate Army. And we'll see what the marker up here says. So you can see here, this is the spot that marks where the 5th Tennessee, under Venable, which is part of Stewart's brigade in Clark's division of Polk's Corps. And they were engaged here from 10 to 1 a.m. or 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. So that would have been kind of in the middle of the first day's fighting. By that point, over further to the left, the engagement had already started at the Hornet's Nest, which would be up straight and back to that side. I'm now on the right wing of the Confederate Army, and by mid-afternoon on April 6th, the Union Army had been pushed back and pushed back and pushed back, and General Johnston, Albert Sidney Johnston, was here directing the Confederate assault on the right flank near this field behind me. And right on the spot where you see the cannon, he took a shot into his leg, and he was immediately let down from his horse. The aides who were with him could not find where he was wounded. They knew he had been hit, but they couldn't find where he was wounded. Well, it turned out he had been shot in the leg. It probably had hit his femoral artery, and if you know anything about that, you know that his time was going to be very short from that point. So after General Johnston was wounded, they actually carried him down into this ravine. It's a pretty steep one, about 50 yards away from where he had been shot, partially because it was safe from enemy fire, being down in a ravine. It was obviously not visible to the Union troops, but it also meant it wasn't visible to most of the Confederate troops, who they didn't want to see their army commander dying of a wound to the leg and thus affect their morale when they were on the verge of a victory. And so they brought him over here, and according to the accounts of the men who were there, when they pulled his boot off, there was just blood everywhere. And at that point, they knew how serious the wound was. And within probably less than 10 or 15 minutes after he had been wounded, General Johnston had died. Now, a lot of debate goes on over questions like, well, you know, what was the turning point of the Civil War? At what point could the South no longer win? And everybody has their own opinions about these things, but I personally believe that if you were to go back and change one moment, any one moment during the Civil War, to give the South a chance for a victory, I think that's the moment. I think if Johnston had not been killed at Shiloh, I do wonder sometimes how things might have been different in the West. And would Grant have had the success that he had against someone like Johnston? And if he didn't have the success against Johnston that he had against less able commanders, would he have been brought east to fight Robert E. Lee? There's just a lot of questions, and I'm curious to know what you think about that. Use the comment section below. Let me know your thoughts about that. But I believe that Johnston's wounding dealt a severe blow to the hopes of the Confederate Army. Well, I'm now not too far from Pittsburg Landing, which would be a few hundred yards behind me, and maybe 200 yards to this direction over here would be the Tennessee River. And what you see behind me, and what I did not know were present in several of them, in fact, are Indian burial mounds here in the Shiloh battlefield. And there's a whole section of the battlefield that is a separate monument park dedicated to preserving these Indian burial mounds and telling their story as well. And you can walk around and see some of those things. I'm not going to get into all that today. Don't have the time to do that justice. But if you have the time when you come here, definitely check this area out. It would be on the Confederate right flank just before you would get up to where Pittsburg Landing is. just from where I'm standing. I don't know how many there are, but I can see 4. There's one there in the distance, right there. There's one here. And then at least 2 more over here. And there may be more than that, but those are the 4 that I've seen so far. Well, by late afternoon on April 6th, the broken units of the Union Army had fallen back here to Pittsburg Landing. You can see behind me down this road is a visitor center, and just out of view would be the National Cemetery and then the river, maybe a quarter mile from here. And it's here on the battlefield that you'll find the largest concentration of monuments, as well as cannon and markers just kind of showing what's going on. They're interspersed throughout the battlefield, but there's a lot here, and you can tell that this is the spot that the Union decided to make their stand. By that point, General Buell had arrived in advance of his Army of the Ohio, and those elements would start arriving late in the day. And so the Chief of Staff under General Grant actually was put in charge of trying to organize and get units into line. And so by the time the Confederates arrived at Pittsburg Landing, there were perhaps 20,000 Union soldiers who were here, fortified and ready to make a fight. And like a lot of battlefields, you get a much better understanding of the significance of the terrain when you actually come and visit. And when you come here, you see why this spot was so important. Pittsburg Landing really is kind of the commanding area. Not only is the rest of the riverfront kind of down at river level, except for Pittsburg Landing, which is a bluff that overlooks, but then also the direction here to the south that the Confederates would have been coming from is downhill. And so this was a strong position for the Union. Plus they were fortified, and it was going to be next to impossible for exhausted Confederates who had been attacking and pushing all day long to have anything left to hit fresh troops as they were arriving from the Army of the Ohio here late on April 6th. Well, late in the day on April 6th, the Confederate right wing actually found itself in this ravine, which would have been an absolutely terrible place to be, because what they had was this ravine here, and just behind me then were the Lexington and the Tyler, which were 2 Union gunboats which were firing into the right of the Confederate forces as they were exhausted after a full day of fighting. They're now down in a ravine trying to attack uphill against a well-defended Union position and being fired on by these gunboats on the Tennessee River. And it was just an impossible situation, and one can understand why they weren't able to complete that attack. So of course behind me is Pittsburg Landing, and on the evening of April 6th, as gunboats were unloading troops, as Buell's army was arriving on this location, it said that General Sherman found Grant and said something to the effect of, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" And Grant said, "Yeah, lick 'em tomorrow though." And that's exactly what they did. They pushed back over all of the ground they had fought over the previous day. They drove the Confederates back off the field, retook all of that ground, would have been fighting over the bodies and probably of the wounded as well. You can imagine on that April morning, April 7th, pushing back, fighting over that same territory where buddies had fallen, where men had been killed. And eventually the Confederates under General Beauregard retreated back to Corinth for at least temporary safety. Another fight was fought at a place called Falling Timbers on the 8th. In fact, I have a cousin who died there, and he's probably buried in an unknown grave in the National Cemetery, which is just behind me right there. His name was Andrew Jackson Duval. I have so many relatives that I research, sometimes it's hard to remember them all. He was actually the first sergeant for Company G of the 77th Ohio Infantry. We've actually got a picture of him And unfortunately, he was killed at Falling Timbers. He's buried in an unmarked grave, or in an unknown grave. And so I decided to take a picture with one of the unknown graves, just as a way of remembering him. And, you know, maybe that is him. So let's take a look at the cemetery. After the battle was over, like in any Civil War battle, the dead were gathered and buried very near to where they fell. Well, after the war, the U.S. government came to the battlefields, and here, very near to the spot where Grant had his headquarters at Pittsburg Landing, alongside the Tennessee River, which is just behind me, in 1866, the Union dead, not only from the Shiloh battle, but also from other nearby battlefields, were brought here to Pittsburg Landing and buried in what became the Shiloh National Cemetery. The Confederate dead, however, were left where they are, and I'll show you some of those graves from the battlefield as I visit those. But behind me you can see the graves of the dead from Shiloh and other battles here at the Shiloh National Cemetery. And just behind me you will see the cannon marker, which actually marks where General Grant's headquarters was on the night of April 6th, 1862. Well, I just took some time to walk through the visitor center here at the Shiloh battlefield. It's pretty small. There's a few relics, a few displays, but it's not the kind of thing you absolutely have to see. If you make it to the battlefield, which is open until dark, then that's really the priority. This is only open until 5 o'clock, and I was in and out in about 5 minutes. But just a couple of closing thoughts about the Battle of Shiloh. Shiloh, obviously, was up to that point the bloodiest battle in American history. More people were killed, wounded, and missing at this battle than had been casualties in all of America's previous wars put together up to that point. The other thing is that there were a number of notable people who fought here who weren't notable yet, but would be. Obviously General Grant, who goes on to lead the entire Union Army. Brigadier General by the name of James Garfield from Northeast Ohio, where I'm from, who would go on to be the 20th President of the United States. Fought here, as did Lew Wallace, who was a general here. Lew Wallace went on to be the governor of New Mexico and also would write the book that became several movies, Ben-Hur. Also here was a Confederate infantryman by the name of Henry Morton Stanley, who would go on to be an explorer in Africa, who spoke the words, Dr. Livingston, I presume. So he was here as well. So just some of the less familiar names associated, well, not less familiar, but certainly less associated with the Battle of Shiloh. So as always, I hope you've enjoyed this little look around at this incredible piece of American history. I hope you get the chance to visit someday. Thanks for watching.